And I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. This week, reports emerged that President Biden is getting ready to endorse some changes to the Supreme Court. Here to explain what these changes are and if they're even at all possible is Kermit Roosevelt. He is a professor at Penn Law. Professor Roosevelt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start at the top. What are these changes that people are talking about and that some members of society want to see made to the Supreme Court?
Well, we don't know exactly which changes Biden might endorse, but there are several out there that are getting the most attention. And I should say I was a member of President Biden's Supreme Court Reform Commission, so I was talking about these with other experts. And what I'm hearing is that he's most likely to suggest one or more of an enforceable ethics code, term limits for Supreme Court justices, or possible but least likely actually court expansion, adding justices to the court.
Let's take those one at a time. You say ethics code, and businesses have ethics codes, other parts of government have ethics codes. Does the Supreme Court not have a code of ethics right now? What's the deal?
Well, it really doesn't. So there's for a long time been a code of ethics for federal judges, which sets out things that they're not supposed to do, and maybe most importantly, circumstances under which they should recuse themselves. They should not hear particular cases if their impartiality could reasonably be questioned. And that code actually does say that it applies to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court for a long time said, no, you can't bind us, we're too important, basically. And then they also said for a while, but we follow this code on our own. And then it turned out they really weren't doing that. Some of the revelations about Clarence Thomas, some of the behavior by Samuel Alito really seems to violate the code that binds all the other federal judges. So partially in reaction to outrage about that, the Supreme Court then said, we've got an ethics code now, like we've written our own ethics code, but no one else can enforce it. We're going to enforce it ourselves. So again, they were saying no one else can tell us what to do. And, here's this code and maybe we'll follow it, maybe we won't, but no one can do anything if we don't. And obviously that's not a good look for the court. And I think it's sort of problematic as a state of affairs for one branch of our government to be saying, we're basically the only people who can decide whether what we're doing is okay or not. So I have a lot of sympathy for the idea of an enforceable ethics code. I think the details might get a little bit tricky because it actually is a pretty big step for Congress to say to some Supreme Court justices, you can't decide this case. So
you bring up
I'm
Congress.
not sure what the details will be like.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was just about to ask because you use the phrase enforceable ethics code and you just mentioned Congress. So is Congress the most likely entity to be the one to enforce that if that were to go in place?
Well, Congress would be the one to write it. So one thing to keep in mind is most of this, we'll get to term limits, but most of this is going to be done through ordinary legislation. So it has to pass both houses of Congress and it has to be signed by the president. And Biden is now saying, I'm willing to do this, but the Republican-controlled House is presumably not. So none of this will happen before the election. None of this will happen if Biden is not elected. None of this will happen if the Democrats don't get control of both houses of Congress. So this is sort of a campaign promise that Biden is making. Not, I'll do this now, but if you reelect me and we get control of Congress, I'll do this.
So it's more like a liberal wish list at this point in time.
Yeah, I think strategically what's going on is Biden is reaching out to the progressive wing of his party, which has long wanted court reform. And he's been resistant to that. He's been more of a centrist institutionalist.